How's it going, everyone? I hope you're having an awesome day. Welcome to the channel. I'm the ChainBaker, and in today's video I'll show you how salt affects bread dough. So let's go to the kitchen and have a closer look. Salt makes up a tiny part of any bread dough, but it has a huge effect on it, and most bread is made with salt nowadays. I have read that salt has only been used in bread making for the last couple of 100 years, which I can't believe. Surely someone would have thought to add salt to bread dough earlier. Bread has been around for thousands of years. But regardless of what the truth is, salt is an essential ingredient in bread making. There's various kinds of salt. You get flaky sea salt crystals, fancy Himalayan pink salt, or regular table salt. I find it funny when people praise the pink salt for its nutritional value. To get any benefit from those nutrients, you'd have to eat so much of it, you'd turn into a piece of jerky. Right, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to make 3 breads. One without salt, so just flour, yeast and water. The second one made with a standard 2% salt. And the final one will be made with way too much salt, at 10%. These are of course extreme examples, and only the 2% dough is the correct one. But it'll be quite interesting to see what happens. I will also show you how to use salt to help with slowing down sourdough starter or a yeasted pre-ferment. This is especially useful in hot kitchens and hot climates. And finally, I'll show you how to use salt in a soaker. A soaker is a method of adding seeds and grains to your bread dough, and I will make a whole separate video covering this topic in detail. Right, so we'll start with the 3 breads. And as ever, this is not a recipe video, so I'm not going to talk you through the steps here. I'm making 3 breads. They contain all the same amount of ingredients except the salt. I will knead them for the same amount of time, I will ferment them for the same amount of time, and I'll bake them the same way. So instead of talking about these breads, I'll talk about salt. At only 1.5 to 2.5%, it makes up a tiny part of any bread dough. This small percentage has a great effect on flavor, texture and fermentation. Salt has a tightening effect on the gluten. It strengthens the dough and makes it more cohesive. As yeast consumes the sugars in the dough, it expels carbon dioxide. It is the carbon dioxide gas that makes our dough rise, and it is the gluten network that holds that carbon dioxide. Bread made without salt is weak, and it's not able to hold that gas very effectively. Besides just improving dough structure, it also greatly enhances flavor. Bread made without salt is bland and has no character. Salt doesn't just make bread salty, it accentuates the flavor of the flour and any other ingredients contained in the dough. Salt helps with controlling fermentation. It draws moisture through the cell walls of yeast in a process called osmosis. Yeast needs water to work effectively, and the more dehydrated it gets, the slower it will work. And this is by no means a bad thing. Breads made without salt can ferment uncontrollably, and generally we want slow controlled fermentation. Longer fermentation equals better flavor. This slowing down property of salt can also be used with pre-ferments. Salt can help with preserving the color and flavor of flour. Unbleached flour has carotenoid pigments, which give the crumb of our bread a creamy color and a wheaty aroma. Salt helps with preserving these carotenoids, as it delays oxidation while mixing. That is why it's always advisable to add the salt at the beginning of the mix when using a mixer. It's not that big of a deal when mixing by hand, but check out the 10% salt dough. It is so loose, it tears super easily, it's so sticky. Although a little bit of salt can help with gluten development, too much salt is obviously detrimental to it. Normally, the total amount of salt in a recipe is calculated as a percentage in relation to the total amount of flour in the recipe. But if you're making a dough which contains a large amount of grains and seeds, then the total amount of salt should be calculated against the total amount of flour plus the grains and seeds. This will ensure that there's a correct balance of flavor. 2% of salt is pretty much the standard across the board. You can of course lower the amounts to reduce your sodium intake, but I wouldn't go lower than 1%. On the other hand, 2.5% is the most that you should ever add, and this would normally be for extremely rich dough, like brioche, which can contain up to 50% butter. Extra salt is necessary in this case for a correct balance of flavor, and that kind of recipe would also generally use more yeast, since the salt and the sugar in the dough will slow down fermentation. Let's get back to our 3 breads for a minute. Clearly the one without salt is fermenting most rapidly, and the one with too much salt hasn't fermented at all. And the dough with no salt is a lot stickier than the other 2, and it feels a lot looser. This is actually the first time I'm making a dough without salt. Do you know any salt-less recipes? Let us know down in the comments. I'm quite curious to find out. I almost never stray away from the 2%. It keeps my calculations simple and it works. I get enough flavor out of it, it slows down the fermentation just enough, and personally I don't think it adds too much salt to my diet. But you can certainly use less, and there are some salt alternatives out there. They may not help with controlling fermentation or give the bread a certain texture, but at least they'll add some flavor to it. There's one more thing that salt will do. It will help with caramelizing the crust of your bread. Because it slows the yeast down, it prevents it from eating up all the sugars in the dough. That residual sugar is what caramelizes the crust, and we'll clearly see the effect of this later on in the video. Right, so we have shaped up all the loaves, they're gone into tins, ready for the final proof. Now, unlike all my previous comparison videos, like in the sugar video or the egg video, where I always give you some kind of workaround, some way of achieving a good result, regardless of how much of the ingredient and which of the ingredients you're using. With salt, there is no workaround. You must stick to the right percentages. Like, there's nothing I could do to fix the dough with 10% salt. It is way too much. It would never rise. The yeast is probably dead. The bread without salt, even though it's almost over fermented, it'll taste totally bland. But let's just pop these in the oven. They'll all bake at the same temperature for the same amount of time. See what we get. And 30 minutes later, here's what we have. Salt really slows down the enzymatic activity. It prevents amylase from breaking down starch into maltose. That's why the loaf on the right is completely white. There is no sugar in it. And whilst too much salt prevents the enzymes from making the sugar, not enough salt will make the yeast eat through all the sugar. And that will also not leave much to caramelize the crust. So the bread in the middle with the right amount of salt has the right amount of caramelization. We can also see that the bread with no salt, it has gained less volume than one with salt. And instead of rising vertically, it has spread out more sideways. This is due to the weakness of the gluten. It prevents the bread from keeping in good shape. But that sorry looking little thing on the right had no chance. Well, let's cut these open, see what's inside, and do the taste test. There should be some clear differences in the crumb. Of course, I'm not talking about the bread made with too much salt. It has no crumb, it's just a piece of dough. It is dense, rubbery, and totally inedible, and I'm definitely not tasting it. Let's move on to the other two. Clearly the bread without salt has a more open crumb, but at the same time it has smaller volume. Now this time an open crumb doesn't mean that it's better. The texture is quite dry and spongy, and it's a little bit rough. It almost feels like a dishwashing sponge. And taste-wise, it's pretty bland. It's not offensive, but it doesn't have any character to it. Of course the sanded loaf is nice and soft. It is exactly what you would expect from regular white bread. And that concludes the 3-dough experiment. But we're not finished yet. I've got a couple more things to show you. Let's continue on with the soaker. Soakers are a great way of adding seeds and grains to your bread, but often these seeds and grains are quite hard. You don't want to bite down on a piece of barley and break a tooth. And that's why quite often a soaker would be made with hot or boiling water. Leaving it to soak at room temperature and keeping it warm for a long time would run the risk of it going off and spoiling. Salt inhibits enzymatic activity. It can prevent the soaker developing off flavors. So adding just 2% of salt to your soaker will ensure that it doesn't get any funky flavors. And as I mentioned earlier, you should account for the amount of seeds and grains and for the flour in the recipe when you're calculating the total amount of salt, because the soaker will absorb a good portion of it. And if you don't add enough salt, you'll end up with a bland tasting loaf. And be sure to check out the Principles of Baking playlist, because I will soon post a dedicated soaker episode. And of course there's many other useful videos you can watch there. Right, finally, let's talk about pre-ferments. They work in the same way as your bread dough, be it made with a sourdough starter or yeast. You would mix your flour, water, yeast or starter and then leave to ferment for several hours ahead of time before making the final dough. Pre-ferments add a great deal of flavor, improve the texture and the keeping quality of your bread. And normally pre-ferments don't contain any salt. And that's why in hot kitchens or hot climates they can ferment too rapidly. There are ways of controlling this. You can lower the temperature of the pre-ferment, you can place it in a cooler area, or even lower the hydration of it. But adding salt is also a great way of controlling the fermentation rate, as we have seen so far. And the exact same percentages apply here. Just remember to deduct the amount of salt used in the pre-ferment from the amount of salt in the final dough. Otherwise you'll end up with too much salt in your recipe. Both of these leavens contain the same amount of water and flour, and they have the same temperature, and both of them are being fermented for 16 hours. The only difference is that the one on the right has 2% salt, And as we can clearly see, it's rising more slowly. Whilst the one on the left is already collapsing, the one on the right is still pushing on. So what did you think of this experiment? Did you learn something new? Let me know down in the comments. To see more videos like this one, click right here. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, I'll see you in the next one.